Welcome to the Stillness Broadcast. Tonight we explore the territories where comfort becomes cage, where seeking solace leads us into spaces we can never leave. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. There's something profound about knowing we're scattered across the world, but gathered here in the dark together, choosing to face what waits in the shadows. If these stories resonate with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the spaces between waking and dreaming. Let's begin. Story 1. Graham Vickers stood at the loading dock of the Valdosta Community Center, watching his breath condense in the November air. The fog had rolled in during the afternoon, that particular southern variety that felt less like weather and more like atmosphere made tangible, pressing against the sodium lights until they became diffuse orange smears in the darkness. At 49 years old, recently terminated from his quality assurance position at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, Graham had discovered that organizing charity drives was both meaningful work and a way to fill days that would otherwise stretch empty as abandoned warehouses. The winter clothing drive was his sixth, and he'd become meticulous about the process. Color-coded logs, receipts filed chronologically, donation slips cross-referenced against inventory spreadsheets. Control was comfort when everything else felt uncertain. The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago. His daughter Emma no longer returned his calls, her silence a punishment he understood he deserved but couldn't quite accept. The charity work was all that remained of his identity as someone who helped, someone who mattered, someone who existed as more than just the sum of his failures. "That's the last of them," called Owen, the young volunteer who helped unload donations. The kid was maybe 22, earnest in that way Graham remembered being before the world taught him otherwise. Weird one at the end, though. Graham walked to where Owen stood beside a black contractor bag, unremarkable except for the smell. Not decay. Graham would have recognized that from his brief stint doing property assessments. This was different. Detergent and fabric softener mixed with something chemical and sharp. Bleach, perhaps. And beneath that, a smell like rust and meat left too long in the refrigerator. "We should probably just toss it," Owen said, stepping back. But Graham was already reaching for the bag, already feeling the need to document, to categorize, to maintain the systems that kept chaos at bay. He pulled the drawstring open and looked inside. Clothes, mostly. A winter coat, dark blue, expensive looking. Several sweaters, jeans, all men's clothing, all sized for someone around Graham's build. At the bottom of the bag, folded with unusual care, was a leather wallet. Someone probably forgot that was in there, Owen offered, but his voice had gone uncertain, the way voices do when people suspect they're wrong but hope they're right. Graham opened the wallet. The driver's license inside showed a man who could have been Graham's brother. Same age, same build, same thinning hair at the temples. Different name, Marcus Wendell, address on Baytree Road. The license had expired 3 months ago. Behind the license, pressed into the clear plastic sleeve where most people kept photos of children or spouses, was a small white card with text printed in careful block letters. "Do not open, do not sort, do not keep, dispose immediately." Graham felt something cold move through his chest, a sensation like ice water spreading through his veins. The kind of cold that had nothing to do with November fog. "What's it say?" Owen asked. Graham closed the wallet, that instinct for control asserting itself. "Just expired ID. I'll handle the disposal." "You can head home. It's Getting late. Owen looked relieved. That universal relief of the young when someone older volunteers to handle the uncomfortable thing. He left quickly, his footsteps echoing across the loading dock and fading into the fog. Graham stood alone with the bag and the wallet and the warning he hadn't heeded. He should have thrown it away. That was the reasonable response, the response a quality assurance professional would make when faced with clear instructions and unusual circumstances. But something in Graham rebelled against that reason. The clothes were good quality. The coat alone was worth $200 easily. Throwing away perfectly functional items felt like waste, felt like the kind of careless excess that had led to his current situation. Unemployed, divorced, alone in the dark of a community center loading dock, holding a dead man's possessions. Dead. He knew Marcus Wendell was dead with the same certainty he knew the fog would still be there tomorrow. That Emma wouldn't call, that the apartment waiting for him was empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture or occupancy. Graham loaded the bag into his Honda Accord and drove home through streets made unfamiliar by fog. The GPS spoke directions in its calm voice, but Graham found himself turning wrong twice, ending up on streets he didn't recognize despite living in Valdosta for 12 years. The fog pressed against his windshield like something curious, something testing the glass for weakness. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted tobacco warehouse on Ashley Street. The building had exposed brick and the particular echo of large spaces divided into smaller ones, sounds bouncing off surfaces that remembered when this had all been one vast room, where men had worked and sweated and died from lung diseases whose names Graham had memorized during his pharmaceutical quality assurance days. He carried the bag upstairs, the smell intensifying in the enclosed space of the stairwell. Chemical sharp, organic underneath. His hands were sweating despite the cold. Inside his apartment, Graham spread the contents across his dining table under the harsh light of the overhead fixture he'd installed himself. That small act of improvement that Sarah had mocked during one of their final arguments. You can't even fix yourself, but you'll replace a light bulb like that's going to save anything. The coat was a Burberry, the label still intact. The sweaters were merino wool, expensive brands Graham recognized from window shopping during better financial times. The jeans were lucky, size 34-32, exactly Graham's measurements. Everything was clean, recently washed, the fabric softener smell overwhelming now that the items were spread out. But beneath that chemical cleanliness, the other smell persisted. Rust and meat and something else Graham couldn't identify. Something that made his hindbrain scream. Warnings his conscious mind kept dismissing. He tried on the coat. It fit perfectly, the sleeves exactly the right length, the shoulders sitting naturally without pulling or bunching. Graham looked at himself in the full-length mirror Sarah had left behind. She'd taken almost everything, but somehow the mirror remained. That daily reminder of himself he could never quite escape. The man in the Burberry coat looked successful, put together, like someone who had his life under control instead of someone whose daughter wouldn't speak to him, whose ex-wife had remarried within 4 months, whose LinkedIn profile gathered dust while rejection emails accumulated in folders Graham had color-coded by company and by polite euphemism for, "We don't want you." He wore the coat the next day to his meeting with his career counselor, a woman named Patricia who had helmet hair and an aggressive smile that suggested she'd gone into helping professions for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine compassion. Patricia complimented the coat, said it projected success, said Graham needed to embody the professional he wanted to become. The smell was still there, faint under the fabric softener, but Patricia didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, and was too professional to mention it. That particular courtesy of strangers who don't want to embarrass you by acknowledging the thing you're already painfully aware of. Graham wore the coat that evening to dinner at the Thai place on Patterson Street, where he ate alone 3 times a week. Where the waitress knew his order and brought it without asking, that small acknowledgement of pattern and routine that felt like connection, even though Graham knew it was just efficiency. He wore it the next morning to his volunteer shift at the community center, where Owen looked at him strangely but didn't say anything. That careful avoidance of confrontation that characterized most of Graham's interactions lately. He wore it that night to bed, unable to explain even to himself why he felt compelled to keep it on. Why taking it off felt like losing something vital. Like surrendering the last piece of evidence that he was someone who mattered. Someone who existed beyond the boundaries of his empty apartment and his unanswered phone calls and his spreadsheets that tracked nothing except the passage of empty time. 3 days after bringing the bag home, Graham found the second wallet. It was tucked into the inner pocket of the coat, a pocket he'd somehow missed during his initial inspection. This wallet was older, more worn, the leather cracked at the corners. The license inside showed a different man, Lawrence Pritchard, age 47, address in Valdosta, expired 2 years ago. Same build as Graham, same thinning hair, same look of quiet desperation that Graham recognized from his own mirror. Behind Lawrence's license was another white card with the same message. Do not open, do not sort, do not keep, dispose immediately. Graham's hands were shaking now. That tremor he'd developed after the layoff. The physical manifestation of anxiety his doctor had said would fade with time and proper medication. He'd stopped taking the medication after 3 weeks because it made him feel disconnected. Because feeling nothing felt worse than feeling everything, even when everything hurt. He searched the coat more carefully. That quality assurance thoroughness asserting itself, even as something deeper screamed at him to stop, to throw it all away, to burn it in the dumpster behind his building, and never think about it again. But Graham had never been good at listening to his instincts. That was part of what had ended his marriage. Sarah's final accusation that he analyzed everything to death. That he couldn't just feel. Couldn't just be, couldn't exist without his spreadsheets and his systems and his desperate need for control. 5 more wallets, hidden in various pockets, each containing a license for a man roughly Graham's age and build, each license expired, each accompanied by the same warning card. 7 men total, counting Marcus Wendell. 7 men who'd owned this coat before Graham, who'd worn it, and walked in it, and eventually stopped walking anywhere at all. Graham Googled their names on his laptop. The screen's glow, the only light in his apartment as midnight approached and the fog pressed against his windows. The searches took hours. He made notes in a spreadsheet, color-coding by date of death, by location, by cause when he could find it. Marcus Wendell died 3 months ago. Heart attack at age 49. No surviving family listed in obituary. Lawrence Pritchard died 2 years ago. Suddenly at home, the obituary said. That euphemism that usually meant suicide. Age 47. Divorced, estranged from adult children. The others followed similar patterns. Men in their 40s and early 50s. Alone. Unsuccessful. Deaths that were sudden but not suspicious, the kind of deaths that happen to men all the time, men who fell through the cracks of society's attention, whose absence was noted briefly and then forgotten. Graham looked at his reflection in his laptop screen. that ghostly overlay of his face against the spreadsheet data. He was still wearing the coat. Had been wearing it for 3 days straight now, sleeping in it. That Burberry wool that smelled of fabric softener and rust and something organic that was definitely stronger now, definitely more present. As if the smell was coming not from the fabric, but from beneath it, from his own skin. He tried to take the coat off. His hands moved to the zipper, gripped it, pulled downward. The zipper moved smoothly, well-oiled, expensive quality. The coat opened, but Graham couldn't shrug it off his shoulders. Not physically couldn't. There was no restraint, no force holding it in place. But the thought of removing it created such profound anxiety, such visceral panic, that his hands refused the instruction, his body rebelling against his conscious mind. This was his coat now. Had been his coat from the moment he'd put it on. Would be his coat until what? Graham understood with sudden clarity that was almost relief. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop fighting and accept what you've known all along. He was number 8. The coat found men like him, men who were alone and unsuccessful and desperate for any evidence that they mattered, that they existed as more than just the sum of their failures. It offered them comfort, offered them the appearance of success, let them feel for a brief time like they were someone worth being. And then it took them, added their license to its collection, and waited in a donation bag for the next lonely man who wouldn't follow simple instructions, who would ignore clear warnings because following rules had never gotten him anywhere. Because rebellion, even stupid, petty rebellion, felt like the only autonomy he had left. The smell was very strong now. Not rust, blood, old blood, and something else. Something that lived in the space between the fabric and the skin. Something that fed slowly and patiently on men who were already dying from loneliness and irrelevance. Graham thought about calling someone, Emma maybe, though she wouldn't answer. The police who would hear his story and see a man in the middle of a breakdown, who would be kind and concerned and ultimately useless. His doctor who would adjust his medication and schedule a follow-up and miss entirely that Graham's problem wasn't chemical imbalance but rather perfect understanding. Instead, he opened his laptop and created a new document. Typed carefully, his fingers steady now that he'd accepted what was coming. He printed the text on cardstock, cut it to size, slipped it into the clear pocket of his own wallet behind his driver's license. Do not open, do not sort, do not keep, dispose. Immediately. No one would listen, of course. He hadn't listened. The next man wouldn't listen either. Men like Graham never did. That was part of why the coat had chosen them, why it waited in donation bags for men who were already half gone, already hollowed out by divorce and unemployment and estrangement. Men who needed so desperately to feel like they mattered that they'd ignore every warning, break every rule, put on a coat that smelled of blood and death, and call it success. Graham Vickers sat in his apartment wearing his Burberry coat, feeling it tighten imperceptibly around his chest, feeling his heart struggle with each beat, and thought about how he'd update his spreadsheet tomorrow if there was a tomorrow, how he'd add his own data to the color-coded cells. That final act of control before control was taken from him entirely. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Emma, something he'd stopped himself from doing 1,000 times. I'm sorry for everything. I love you. I hope someday you'll remember I tried. He didn't send it. Emma didn't need that burden. Didn't need the guilt that would come from reading final words she couldn't respond to, couldn't fix, couldn't make better through any action of her own. Instead, Graham deleted the message and lay down on his couch, still wearing the coat, feeling it settle around him like a blanket, like comfort, like the embrace of someone who understood exactly how tired he was, how ready he was to stop fighting, how grateful he was that something, even something terrible, had noticed his existence, had chosen him specifically, had made him matter, even if only as the 8th wallet in a collection that would someday hold a 9th. Control was all he had left, and control had abandoned him. But perhaps, Graham thought, as his breathing became labored and his vision narrowed to a tunnel of darkness, perhaps that was its own kind of relief. Story 2. The apartment smelled of nothing when Cora Geller first crossed its threshold. She stood in the center of the living room, breathing carefully through her nose, testing the air the way Dr. Ringgold had taught her during their Tuesday sessions. Mindful engagement with space, the therapist called it, though she'd never explained what one was supposed to do when space itself seemed to be holding its breath. Cora was 32, recently relocated from Baltimore for a position at Salem University's linguistics department, and had spent 3 years in intensive therapy learning to manage anxiety that Dr. Ringgold described as acute but treatable, and Cora experienced as a constant low-grade certainty that catastrophe waited around every corner, behind every door, in every silence that lasted too long. The apartment was a studio on Essex Street, the 3rd floor of a Victorian that had been chopped into 6 units sometime in the 1970s. That particular era of renovation that prioritized efficiency over aesthetics. The floors were the original hardwood, scarred but solid. The windows faced east, letting in the pale October light that made Salem look like a watercolor painting, all soft edges and muted tones. And it was cheap, remarkably cheap. $800 a month in a city where studio apartments routinely ran $1,500. Cora's fingers had hesitated over the deposit check, that familiar anxiety whispering its warnings, but she'd signed anyway. She couldn't afford not to. The landlord was a man named Robert Chen, probably 60, with the distracted air of someone whose attention was always partly elsewhere. He'd handed her the keys without ceremony, mentioned that utilities were included, and left her standing alone in the empty apartment with its absence of smell and its silence that felt less like peace and more like waiting. Cora had grown up in spaces that smelled like something. Her mother's cigarettes, her father's cologne, the burnt coffee that was always brewing in the kitchen of their row house in Baltimore. Even her graduate school apartment had smelled of old books and the particular mustiness of buildings near water. Smell was how spaces announced themselves, how they became real and occupied and knowable. This apartment smelled of absolutely nothing. Not paint, not cleaning products, not the residual presence of previous tenants cooking or smoking or living. Nothing. She mentioned it to Dr. Ringgold during their first video session after the move. I know it sounds strange, but it bothers me. Shouldn't it smell like something? Dr. Ringgold, whose pale gray eyes suggested Eastern European ancestry she'd never confirmed or denied, considered this with her characteristic pause before responding. Absence isn't always meaningful, Cora. Sometimes a clean apartment is simply clean. But Cora couldn't shake the feeling that absence was exactly the point, that the apartment's lack of smell was less about cleanliness and more about something she didn't yet have words for. She moved her belongings in over 2 days, a depressingly small collection of furniture, boxes of books, clothes she'd accumulated during her 20s when she'd still believed beautiful things might make her beautiful by proximity. The apartment absorbed it all without changing, without acknowledging occupation. Her coffee maker sat on the counter like a foreign object. Her bed looked temporary even after she'd made it with the sheets her mother had given her. Egyptian cotton that was supposed to feel like luxury but mostly reminded Cora that she was sleeping alone in a strange city where she knew no one except department colleagues who smiled politely and never invited her to anything. The silence was absolute. Cora had lived in apartments where she heard neighbors through the walls, their televisions and arguments and footsteps overhead, a constant reminder that other humans existed in adjacent spaces. Here, she heard nothing. Not the couple she'd seen leaving the second-floor unit, not the elderly woman she'd passed in the hallway, not traffic from Essex Street, even though the windows faced the road, and Salem wasn't exactly a quiet city in October when the tourists came for the witch trial history and the Halloween atmosphere. Dr. Ringgold would tell her this was anxiety creating problems where none existed, that her mind was manufacturing concerns to justify the familiar panic that had shaped her life since adolescence. Cora tried to believe that. She went to work, taught her classes on historical linguistics, ate lunch in her office, came home to the apartment that smelled of nothing and sounded like nothing and felt increasingly like nowhere. 3 weeks after moving in, she found the painting. It was in the bedroom closet, tucked behind the built-in shelving where previous tenants had stored boxes of forgotten things. A canvas maybe 2 feet square, unframed. The painting showed a woman sitting in a chair, hands folded in her lap, expression serene. The style was hyper-realistic, the kind of technical precision that made the image uncomfortable to look at. That uncanny valley between representation and reality that triggered some primitive warning system in Cora's brain. The woman in the painting could have been Cora's older sister. Same bone structure, same dark hair, same slight overbite that Cora had been self-conscious about until she'd stopped smiling enough for people to notice. Different age. The painted woman looked maybe 40, but the resemblance was undeniable. Cora carried the painting to the living room, propped it against the wall, and stared at it for longer than was reasonable. The woman's eyes followed her with that optical illusion common to portraits, that sense of being observed regardless of viewing angle. But this was more than illusion. Cora felt seen in a way that made her skin prickle, that made her want to turn the painting around or cover it, or take it immediately to the dumpster behind the building. Instead, she texted a photo to Dr. Ringgold with the caption, "Found this in my apartment. Looks like me. Coincidence?" Dr. Ringgold responded an hour later. "Pareidolia, pattern recognition. Our brains find faces everywhere, especially familiar ones." Interesting find, though. Cora knew the term. Had studied it in grad school, that human tendency to see meaningful patterns in random data. But this wasn't random. This was specific. This was a woman who shared Cora's features sitting in what looked increasingly like the chair Cora had bought from a thrift store on Darby Street, sitting in front of a window that matched the dimensions of Cora's east-facing window, wearing an expression Cora recognized from photographs of herself. That careful serenity that was really just fear pressed flat, anxiety trained into stillness. She hung the painting in the bedroom, telling herself she was being ridiculous, that Dr. Ringgold was right, that her anxiety was manufacturing significance from coincidence. She went to bed and tried not to think about the woman in the painting sitting vigil in her closet, watching nothing, waiting for something Cora couldn't name. The smell started 4 days later. Subtle at first, sweet but chemical, like perfume mixed with cleaning solution. It was strongest in the morning, as if it accumulated overnight while Cora slept, then faded during the day when she was at work. By the second week, the smell was constant, thick enough to taste. That particular combination of floral and chemical that triggered Cora's gag reflex, that made her eyes water when she first entered the apartment after teaching. She bought air fresheners, opened windows despite the October chill, cleaned every surface with vinegar and baking soda solutions she'd found on anxiety forums where people discussed contamination fears and purification rituals. Nothing helped. The smell persisted, grew stronger, became a presence of its own, her colleagues noticed. Dr. Simmons, the department chair, mentioned during a meeting that Cora's office had quite a strong fragrance. One of her students asked if she was wearing a new perfume, said it was really intense, like, in a bad way. But Cora wasn't wearing perfume. Hadn't worn perfume since high school when she'd learned that anxiety and fragrance combined to create nausea so profound she'd had to leave class twice in 1 week. The smell was coming from her somehow, from her clothes or her hair or her skin, absorbed from the apartment like smoke from a fire. She told Dr. Ringgold during their session, heard her own voice going high and tight the way it did when panic was close. I can't get it off. I've washed everything, changed detergent. The smell is in me somehow. Have you seen a doctor? Dr. Ringgold's voice was careful. That practiced neutrality that meant she was thinking something she wasn't saying. Some medical conditions can cause unusual odors. It might be worth ruling out physical causes. Cora made an appointment with a physician at Salem Hospital, a woman named Dr. Kane, who performed a thorough examination and found nothing. You're healthy, Ms. Geller. No infections, no metabolic issues, no reason I can find for unusual body odor. She'd paused, made a note in Cora's chart. Have you considered that this might be related to your anxiety? Olfactory hallucinations are more common than people think, especially in individuals with anxiety disorders. But Cora's colleagues smelled it. Her students smelled it. This wasn't hallucination. This was real as the apartment that smelled of nothing and the painting of a woman who looked like Cora's future, sitting serene and still and waiting. She researched the building's history on the Salem Public Library's digital archives, spending hours scrolling through property records and old newspaper articles. The building had been constructed in 1898, originally a single-family home, converted to apartments in 1973. No records of for deaths or crimes. Nothing unusual except one brief mention in a 2006 newspaper article about a woman named Sarah Matheson who disappeared from the third-floor studio. Police had investigated, found no evidence of foul play. Case remained open but inactive. Sarah was 28 when she vanished, dark-haired, approximately Cora's height and build based on the description. Cora stood in her apartment reading the article on her laptop and felt something cold settle in her chest. The smell was overwhelming now, making her dizzy. She looked at the painting in her bedroom, visible through the open door. The woman in the painting seemed closer somehow, as if she'd leaned forward while Cora wasn't watching, as if she was trying to communicate something across the boundary between painted canvas and living flesh. That night, Cora dreamed she was sitting in a chair in front of her east-facing window, hands folded in her lap, unable to move, while something in the apartment's walls breathed slowly and patiently, waiting for her to become still enough, compliant enough, empty enough to join the collection of women who'd lived here before, who'd sat in this space and smelled this smell and eventually stopped moving. Stopped breathing, stopped existing as anything except images frozen in canvas and frames. She woke gasping, the smell so thick she could barely breathe through it. Her skin felt wrong, tight and itchy like she was wearing someone else's body. She ran to the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror. The reflection looked older, not dramatically. She'd need to study photographs to be sure, but subtly aged as if weeks had passed instead of hours. Lines around her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. A thinness to her face that suggested weight loss she didn't. Remember, hair that looked duller, grayer at the roots. Cora called Dr. Ringgold at 3 a.m, left a voicemail that was probably incoherent. Something about the painting and the smell and the woman who disappeared, and the reflection that wasn't quite right. She didn't expect a response until their scheduled session, but Dr. Ringgold called back at 7. Cora, I need you to listen carefully. I think you should consider leaving the apartment for a few days. Stay with a colleague or check into a hotel. Get some distance and let's reassess. You think I'm having a breakdown? Cora's voice was flat. I think you're experiencing severe anxiety in a new environment, and sometimes a change of scenery helps interrupt the cycle. Will you do that for me? Cora agreed because that's what people did when their therapist used that particular tone. She packed a bag, called in sick to work, checked into a Holiday Inn on Route 1 that smelled aggressively of industrial air freshener and cleaning chemicals, but was at least a smell she could identify. A smell that came from products and not from whatever lived in the apartment on Essex Street. She stayed away for 4 days. The smell faded from her clothes, from her hair. Her reflection looked like herself again, though she couldn't quite remember what had looked different. Couldn't pinpoint the specific changes she'd been certain she'd seen. Dr. Ringgold scheduled daily video sessions, guided her through breathing exercises, reminded her that anxiety was treatable, that this was a setback but not a disaster. On the 5th day, Cora went back to the apartment. She told herself she was being brave, confronting her fear, taking back control. Dr. Ringgold had encouraged this return, said avoidance would only strengthen the anxiety's hold. The apartment smelled of nothing, that complete absence of odor that had disturbed her when she'd first moved in. Her belongings were exactly where she'd left them, laptop on the table, dishes in the sink, bed unmade. The painting still hung in the bedroom, the woman still sitting with her careful serenity. Cora sat down in her chair by the east window, meant to stand right back up, meant to finish unpacking her bag from the hotel, meant to call Dr. Ringgold and report that she'd returned successfully, that exposure therapy worked, that she was fine, but the chair was so comfortable, the mooring light so perfectly gentle, and the smell was returning, that sweet chemical perfume that made her dizzy but also somehow calm, as if her body was remembering something her conscious mind had forgotten, as if this was always where she was supposed to end up, had been moving towards since the moment she'd signed the lease and ignored the voice that whispered warnings about apartments that were too cheap, too quiet, too empty. Cora's phone rang. Dr. Ringgold's number. She meant to answer it. Her hand even moved toward the phone on the table beside her, but the movement was slow, dreamlike, and before her fingers made contact, the ringing stopped. She sat in the chair by the window, hands folding naturally in her lap, and thought about the woman who disappeared in 2006. About Sarah Matheson, who was dark-haired and Cora's height and build, and who'd probably sat right here in this exact chair, breathing this exact smell, feeling her body become still and serene and perfectly eternally calm. There was another painting in the closet. Cora knew this without looking, knew it with certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with understanding that sometimes spaces collected people, that sometimes apartments were cheap for reasons that had nothing to do with market rates. That sometimes the absence of smell meant something was holding its breath, waiting patiently for the next portrait to paint itself. Dr. Ringgold called again and again. Eventually, she'd send someone to check, police or landlord or colleague. They'd find the apartment empty of Cora but full of her belongings, would find the painting in the bedroom, and maybe another painting hidden in the closet, would write reports about women who disappeared from third-floor studio apartments on Essex Street. And eventually someone else would move in. Someone who needed cheap housing badly enough to ignore warnings, who was anxious enough to dismiss their own instincts, who would find paintings of women who looked like future versions of themselves and convince themselves it was coincidence, pattern recognition, pareidolia. The smell was perfect now, sweet and chemical and welcoming. Cora breathed deeply, felt it settle into her lungs like perfume, like poison, like the scent of a place that had claimed her from the first moment she'd crossed its threshold and thought too cheap was still cheap enough. She sat very still by the window, hands folded in her lap, and waited for the artist whose signature was absence to add her portrait to the collection. And every day she looked a little more like the painting, and a little less like herself. Story 3. Nolan Hetherington was checking the lamp in the Gull Point Lighthouse when he first heard the singing. The time was 3:18 in the morning. He'd glanced at his watch out of habit, that need to mark the passage of hours that characterized his 2 months of isolation on this particular outcropping of rock 12 miles off the Maine coast. The lamp's Fresnel lens caught the moonlight, throwing refracted patterns across the service room's walls like shattered glass made luminous. The voice came from the east, from the direction of open ocean where nothing existed except water and darkness, and occasionally the running lights of distant cargo ships making the crossing from Portland to Halifax. It was a woman's voice, clear despite the wind, singing something without words, just pure melody that rose and fell with the rhythm of waves against rock. Nolan stood perfectly still, listening. He was 56 years old, recently retired from 30 years teaching high school mathematics in Lewiston, and had taken this lighthouse keeper position because solitude seemed preferable to the alternative, returning daily to the house he'd shared with Marie, whose absence 3 years after the cancer took her still felt like amputation, like walking through spaces designed for 2 people with only half a self remaining. The song continued, beautiful and strange and completely impossible. There were no boats visible from the windows, no swimmers. The water temperature in November was 48 degrees, survivable for maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia made the body stop obeying the mind's instructions. No one could be out there singing. No one human, anyway. Nolan had been briefed during his orientation about the psychological effects of isolation, auditory hallucinations, visual distortions, the way the mind invented companionship when starved of human contact. He'd been alone for 63 days. Perhaps this was the beginning of that dissolution, his brain creating presence where none existed because loneliness was a survival crisis the body responded to by manufacturing connection, even false connection. He went to bed, descended the spiral stairs from the lamp room to his quarters on the 2nd level, and lay in the narrow bed listening to wind and waves and the distant sound of singing that continued for another hour before fading with the tide. The next morning, Nolan performed his routine maintenance with the methodical precision that had made him successful as a math teacher. Inspected the lamp mechanism, logged fuel levels, checked weather reports on the radio transmitter. That was his only link to the mainland station. Ate breakfast, oatmeal and coffee, while watching gray light spread across gray water under gray sky. That particular New England palette where color seemed like something that happened elsewhere. He didn't mention the singing in his log. Didn't report it during his weekly radio check with Dennis, the coordinator who managed the automated lighthouses along this stretch of coast, and seemed perpetually surprised that Nolan had volunteered for manual service at Gull Point when automation was available and infinitely more reliable. All quiet? Dennis's voice crackled through static, that compression of human speech that made everyone sound older and farther away than they actually were. All quiet, Nolan confirmed, and the lie felt like loyalty, like protection of something he didn't yet understand, but already knew he wanted to keep. The singing returned the second night. Same time, 3:18 in the morning. Nolan was waiting for it this time, standing in the lamp room with the windows open despite the cold, letting the November wind cut through his fleece and thermal layers until his skin ached with it. The voice was clearer tonight, close enough that he could hear subtle harmonics, could detect the places where the melody repeated or varied. It wasn't random. It was structured, purposeful, a song with verses and chorus, even though the words, if there were words, remained incomprehensible. He leaned out the window, scanning the water. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to see the rocks below, where waves shattered into foam and spray, bright enough to see the figure sitting on the eastern rocks partially submerged. Long hair dark with water, arms raised as if conducting the ocean itself. Nolan's rational mind offered explanations. A seal. They hauled out on these rocks regularly, their vocalizations sometimes eerily human. A hallucination, his isolation-starved brain projected onto darkness and shadow. A swimmer in a wetsuit, though what swimmer would be out here at 3 in the morning singing to the lighthouse was a question his rational mind couldn't quite answer. The figure turned, looked directly up at the lamp room where Nolan stood, and waved. A slow, deliberate gesture of greeting, recognition, invitation. Nolan pulled back from the window, heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with a primal understanding that some invitations shouldn't be accepted, that some recognitions meant danger dressed as welcome. He didn't sleep, sat instead in his quarters with a book he didn't read, watching the eastern window for movement, for evidence that something had climbed from the water onto the rocks, had made its way to the lighthouse door that he'd locked and bolted and propped with a chair as if furniture could stop whatever lived in the ocean, and sang with a woman's voice. Dawn came eventually, that gray bleeding into less gray, that passed for sunrise. Nolan inspected the rocks from the gallery deck that circled the lamp room. No evidence of occupation. No footprints in the bird guano and lichen that covered every surface. No signs that anyone or anything had been there except waves and wind and the cormorants that nested in the crags and watched Nolan with eyes that held neither fear nor interest. He radioed Dennis during his scheduled check. Question about the previous keeper. Why did he leave? Static. Then Dennis's compressed voice. Henry, medical leave. Requested transfer to land station. What kind of medical leave? More static. Longer this time. Mental health, I think. Why? Just curious about the position history. Dennis didn't respond immediately. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, something careful and measuring. You doing okay out there, Nolan? 2 months is when it usually starts getting difficult. I'm fine, just making conversation. But he wasn't fine. That night, he heard the singing again, and the night after, and the night after that. Always 3:18 in the morning, always from the eastern rocks, always beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, that reminded him of Marie's voice on their wedding day, of the lullabies she'd sung when their daughter was a baby, of all the sounds that meant love and connection and belonging that had been taken from him when the cancer took her. Nolan started leaving the lighthouse door unlocked, started sitting in the lamp room at 3:15, waiting, started singing back, tentative at first, then with more confidence, harmonizing with that impossible voice until the lamp room filled with sound that was part human and part something else, something that lived in the boundary between water and air, between loneliness and connection, between wanting to be found and knowing that being found meant being consumed. The figure appeared on the rocks every night now, close enough that Nolan could see it wasn't a seal, wasn't a swimmer, wasn't anything his rational mind had vocabulary for. It had a woman's shape mostly, but the proportions were wrong in ways that suggested bones arranged differently, that suggested limbs that could articulate in directions human joints couldn't manage. The face was beautiful in that same way the singing was beautiful, appealing to something deep and hungry and desperate, bypassing all the survival instincts that should have sent Nolan back to the mainland, back to safety, back to loneliness that was at least human and comprehensible. He dreamed about going into the water, dreamed about descending the exterior stairs, crossing the rocks, stepping into that 48-degree ocean and feeling it close over his head like welcome. In the dreams, he could breathe underwater, could see through the darkness to where she waited, could feel her embrace that was cold and patient and endless. He woke from these dreams gasping, sheets soaked with sweat despite the November cold, and couldn't remember if he'd actually gotten out of bed, if he'd actually stood on the rocks with the ocean singing at his feet before survival instinct pulled him back. Dennis noticed during the weekly check. "You sound different. You sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," Nolan said, and maybe it was even true. He felt more alive than he had in 3 years, felt present in his body in a way he hadn't since Marie's diagnosis, since the beginning of that long dying that had taken 2 years to complete. Cowan left him hollow, going through motions of living without any of the substance that made life worth the effort. "I'm sending a relief keeper next week," Dennis said. "You need a break, couple days on the mainland." "That's not necessary. It's procedure. 2-month rotation, 1 week off. You knew this when you signed up." Nolan wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but couldn't articulate why without revealing the singing, the figure, the invitation he was increasingly certain he wanted to accept. So he agreed, said the polite things, and spent the next 5 days in a state of anticipation that felt like grief in reverse, like watching something precious approach instead of recede. The relief keeper arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered by the Coast Guard tender that made supply runs to the manned stations. His name was Marcus, maybe 30, with the enthusiastic confidence of someone who'd read all the manuals and believed that preparation equaled readiness. "Anything unusual I should know about?" Marcus asked while Nolan packed his minimal belongings. Some clothes, books, the photographs of Marie he'd brought, but never looked at because looking hurt in ways that weren't productive. "Cormorants nest on the East Rocks," Nolan said. They're loud. Don't let it bother you. That's it. That's it. The tender took him back to the mainland station at Pemaquid Point, where he spent a week going through the motions of reintegration. Showers in facilities that had hot water on demand. Meals in a dining hall where other people sat and ate, and made conversation he couldn't follow because it was about things that happened on land, in cities, in the world of people who weren't waiting for 3:18 in the morning when the ocean would sing them home. He called his daughter in Portland. Melissa answered on the fourth ring, her voice carrying that particular mixture of duty and distance that characterized their interactions since Marie's death, since Nolan had pulled away from everything that hurt, which was everything that reminded him he was still alive, while Marie was not. "Dad, you okay?" "I'm fine. Just calling to check in." "You sound different." "I've been alone for 2 months. Probably forgot how to talk to people." Melissa laughed, but it was worried laughter. "Maybe this lighthouse thing wasn't such a good idea. You could come stay with us for a while. Get back into the world." "I am in the world," Nolan said, and knew even as he said it that he was lying, that the world he inhabited now was different from the world Melissa lived in, that he'd crossed some threshold during those 2 months at Gull Point and couldn't quite remember what it had been like to exist on the other side. He returned to the lighthouse the following Wednesday. Marcus looked exhausted, his enthusiasm eroded by a week of isolation and the particular boredom of waiting for something to break that never breaks. "Quiet week?" Nolan asked. "Yeah, except..." Marcus hesitated. "You ever hear weird sounds at night? Like singing?" Nolan's pulse quickened. "No, what did you hear?" "Probably nothing. Seals, maybe. Just, it was strange. Made me think of my ex-girlfriend, which is crazy because I haven't thought about her in 2 years." "Seals," Nolan agreed. "They can sound very human." The tender left. Nolan stood on the gallery deck watching it disappear toward the mainland, feeling relief so profound it was almost vertigo. He was home. This lighthouse, this rock, this isolation was home, in a way nowhere had been since Marie died. And tonight, at 3:18, he would hear the singing again. And this time, he thought he might finally do what he'd been dreaming about, might finally accept the invitation that had been offered every night for 9 weeks. He waited in the lamp room, doors open despite the cold. 3:15, 3:16, 3:17. His heart was racing. His hands were shaking. He felt like a teenager waiting for a first date, that mixture of terror and anticipation that made every second stretch impossibly long. 3:18. The singing started, perfect and familiar and calling him by name, even though the voice had no words. Had never needed words because loneliness speaks its own language, and Nolan was fluent. Had been fluent since the day Marie's breathing stopped and left him alone in a world that continued without acknowledging that the most important person in it had ceased to exist. He descended the stairs, walked to the exterior door, crossed the rocks, feeling spray from the waves soak through his clothes. The figure waited at the edge, arms extended, face beautiful and terrible, and exactly what Nolan had been looking for, even though he hadn't known he was looking until he heard that first night song. The water was 48 degrees, cold enough to stop the heart in minutes, cold enough that drowning would feel like sleep, like surrender, like the embrace of something that wanted him not despite his grief, but because of it, that fed on loneliness the way the ocean fed on anything foolish enough to venture into its depths. Nolan stepped into the water, felt it close around his ankles, his knees, his waist, felt arms that weren't quite arms pull him deeper, felt himself sinking into darkness that sang with a woman's voice. that promised he would never be alone again, that guaranteed loneliness would end here, that this was what he'd wanted all along, not to live without grief, but to stop living entirely, to join Marie wherever the dead went, to finish what her cancer had started and he'd been too afraid to complete until the ocean offered to complete it for him. The Coast Guard found his body 3 days later, washed up on the rocks at high tide. The investigation concluded accidental drowning, noted that lighthouse keepers working alone sometimes grew disoriented or depressed, recommended the station be fully automated to prevent future incidents. The lighthouse still stands at Gull Point, its lamp automated now, flashing its warning to ships that pass in the night. And sometimes, at 3:18 in the morning, when the tide is right and the wind is still, fishermen 12 miles off the coast report hearing singing from the rocks, beautiful and strange, and calling to anyone lonely enough, grieving enough, empty enough to answer. Story 4. Dr. Meredith Kane sat in her private practice office on Divisadero Street, San Francisco, watching rain streak the windows and waiting for her 3 o'clock appointment, who was now 7 minutes late, which wasn't like Janet Marsh at all. Meredith was 43, 15 years into her career as a clinical psychologist specializing in grief counseling, and had developed the particular mixture of patience and boundary enforcement that separated effective therapists from martyrs who burned out trying to save people who didn't want saving. Janet Marsh fell into neither category. Janet wanted help desperately. That was part of the problem. The door buzzer sounded. Meredith pressed the release, heard footsteps on the stairs. Her office was second floor of a converted Victorian, the kind of building San Francisco was gradually losing to earthquake retrofitting and developer ambition. Janet appeared in the doorway, wet from the rain, looking worse than she had last week, which was saying something considering last week. She'd looked like she'd stopped sleeping entirely. "Sorry I'm late." Janet's voice was hoarse. That roughness that came from crying or not speaking or both. Traffic was bad. "It's okay. Come in." Janet sat in the chair across from Meredith's desk. They did traditional talk therapy rather than the couch arrangement that had fallen out of favor except with analysts who clung to Freudian orthodoxy like life preservers. Janet was 38, worked in tech, had lost her partner Daniel 9 months ago to a car accident that had been sudden and senseless in the way the worst tragedies always were. Grief had changed her. That was normal. Grief changed everyone. But Janet's changes went beyond the expected weight loss and insomnia and fog of depression that characterized acute mourning. She looked older, dramatically older, as if the 9 months since Daniel's death had aged her 15 years. Her skin had a gray quality that suggested illness. Her hands trembled constantly. Her eyes held a specific kind of desperation that Meredith had learned to recognize in patients who were considering options they wouldn't articulate in session. "How was your week?" Meredith's standard opening, that gentle invitation to begin. I saw him again. Janet's voice was flat. 3 times. Tuesday night, Thursday morning, yesterday afternoon. They'd been working on this for 6 weeks now. The seeing started a month after Daniel's death. Janet would encounter him in public spaces, on the bus, in the grocery store, walking past her apartment building. Not ghosts, not hallucinations, real, physical, present. He never acknowledged her, never made eye contact, just existed in the periphery of her life like a reminder that death was both absolute and somehow negotiable. "And what did you do when you saw him?" Meredith kept her voice neutral, that therapeutic non-judgment that was harder than it looked. "Followed him. Tuesday night, I followed him for 6 blocks before I lost him in the crowd near the ferry building. Thursday, I was too slow. He got on a bus before I could. Yesterday, I almost caught him. Got close enough to touch his shoulder. Did you touch him? No, I wanted to, but I was afraid. Janet stopped, looked at her hands. I was afraid he'd disappear. Or worse, I was afraid he'd turn around and it would be someone else. Someone who just looked like Daniel, and I'd have to accept all over again that he's dead. This was the paradox Meredith had observed in her grief counseling practice. Patients knew intellectually that their loved ones were gone, but emotionally, psychologically, the mind created elaborate frameworks for denying that permanence. Saw the dead person in crowds, heard their voice, felt their presence, the mind protecting itself from loss by pretending loss hadn't occurred. Janet, we've talked about how grief can manifest as... It's not grief. Janet's voice was sharp. I know what you think, that I'm hallucinating, that my brain is creating Daniel because I can't accept he's gone. But other people see him too. Last week on the bus, the woman next to me nudged her friend and said, "That guy looks exactly like the man in the news article about the accident on 101. That was Daniel. She saw him. He's real." Meredith made notes. That professional documentation that was part record-keeping and part thinking space. She'd reviewed Daniel's death extensively. Accident reports, news coverage, even reached out to the medical examiner's office, under the guise of confirming details for Janet's therapy. Daniel Mercer was definitively dead, died on impact, body cremated per his wishes, ashes scattered by Janet in Point Reyes where they'd planned to get married before the accident rearranged their future into absence. What would it mean if Daniel was alive? Meredith asked. How would that change things for you? Everything. It would change everything. It would mean... Janet stopped again. That habit of interruption that suggested her thoughts were moving faster than her ability to articulate them. It would mean I don't have to be alone, that I don't have to figure out how to live in a world where the person who defined my life doesn't exist. It would mean I get a second chance. Second chances. That's what grief wanted, ultimately. The opportunity to redo the last conversation, to say the unsaid things, to prevent the preventable, to change what was fixed. Meredith had sat with hundreds of grieving patients and heard hundreds of variations on the same desperate wish. That death was negotiable, that love was strong enough to pull someone back across the boundary between existence and absence. I need to try something, Meredith said. An exposure technique. Next time you see Daniel, I want you to approach him. Get close enough to confirm whether it's actually him or someone who resembles him. Can you do that? Janet nodded. That eager compliance of patients who wanted permission to do what they were already planning to do. They finished the session. Janet left looking slightly less desperate, which Meredith counted as progress, even though she knew the desperation would return, that grief was cyclical, that healing wasn't linear, but rather a series of loops that gradually widened until the pain was present but no longer disabling. Meredith wrote up her session notes, saw 2 more patients, a divorce and anxiety disorder, and locked her office at 7. The rain had stopped, leaving the city wet and reflecting streetlight in that particular way that made San Francisco look like a watercolor painting someone had spilled water on. She walked to her car, parked 3 blocks away, because Divisadero Street had parking like most of San Francisco had parking, which was to say inadequately and expensively. unlocked her Subaru, got in, started the engine. Someone knocked on her passenger window. Meredith looked, saw a man standing in the rain that had apparently started again while she was getting into her car. He was maybe 40, vaguely familiar in the way people you've seen in photographs are familiar, and he was gesturing for her to roll down the window. She cracked it an inch, that compromise between engagement and safety that women learned early and never forgot. "Dr. Kane?" His voice was muffled through the glass. "Do I know you? I'm Daniel Mercer, Janet's partner. I need to talk to you about her." Meredith's rational mind offered explanations. Mistaken identity. This wasn't Daniel, just someone who resembled him. Delusion, the man thought he was Daniel. Some kind of Fragoli syndrome where people believe strangers are familiar persons in disguise. Fraud. Someone cruel playing an elaborate trick on a grieving woman. But none of those explanations accounted for the specific way he said Janet's name. The particular grief in his voice that matched what Meredith heard in Janet's voice when she talked about Danielle. The way he looked exactly like the photographs Janet had, shown during their early sessions, photographs Meredith had studied while trying to understand what Janet was grieving. Who Daniel had been. "Daniel Mercer is dead," Meredith said through the cracked window. "He died 9 months ago in a car accident on 101. I know, I was there, I remember it. But I'm here now, and Janet keeps finding me, and every time she gets close to touching me, He stopped, looked at his hands. Something happens. I can feel it. Like I'm being pulled back to wherever I was before I was here. This isn't possible. I know, but it's happening anyway. And I need you to tell Janet to stop looking for me, because if she touches me, if she makes contact, I think we'll both disappear. I think that's how it works." Meredith sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, rational mind screaming that this was a delusion or a trick or a breakdown, that she needed to drive away immediately and call the police and possibly her own therapist, because exposure to patient trauma sometimes created vicarious traumatization, sometimes made therapists start seeing what their patients saw. But Daniel Mercer stood in the rain outside her car window, looking desperate and real and impossible, and Meredith found herself asking the question she'd been trained never to ask. "Where were you after the accident? Where did you go?" "Nowhere. Nothing. I don't have words for it. It was like being asleep but aware of the sleep. Aware that I should wake up but couldn't. And then Janet started looking for me. Started seeing me. And every time she saw me, I became more solid. More here. Her grief is pulling me back. But I'm not supposed to be back. Death doesn't work that way. And if I stay, if I become fully real again, something else will have to take my place. That's the rule. That's the cost." "What do you mean, something else?" "Her. Janet. If I come back, she goes. One life for another. That's the exchange." Meredith heard herself say, "This is impossible. I know. Tell her anyway. Tell her to stop looking. Tell her to let me stay dead." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain and the San Francisco night. And Meredith sat in her car for 20 minutes trying to decide if that had actually happened, or if she'd just experienced an acute dissociative episode brought on by stress and over-identification with her patient's grief. She drove home to her apartment in the Sunset, ate dinner she didn't taste, and spent 3 hours researching psychiatric conditions that might explain what she'd seen. Capgras syndrome, Fragoli syndrome, shared psychotic disorder. None of them fit. She wasn't psychotic. She didn't have any history of delusions. She was a clinical psychologist with 15 years of experience and appropriate boundaries and a firm grounding in reality. Except reality had just expanded to include the possibility that grief was powerful enough to pull the dead back across whatever boundaries separated existence from absence. That love was literally strong enough to resurrect, and that resurrection required payment in the form of the person doing the loving. She couldn't tell Janet. That was unethical, probably malpractice, definitely the kind of thing that got therapists reported to licensing boards. But she also couldn't let Janet continue seeking Danielle if seeking him would kill her. Meredith spent 2 days trying to decide what to do, consulted the ethics guidelines, called a colleague in Boston who specialized in grief work, and asked hypothetically what one did when a patient's delusion seemed to be manifesting in reality. The colleague recommended Meredith take a vacation, said vicarious traumatization was serious, said everyone in grief work eventually needed a break. But Meredith didn't take a break. Instead, she did research, searched archives of psychiatric journals for case studies of patients who claimed to see their dead loved ones and were validated somehow, who experienced grief in ways that violated natural law. She found nothing useful. Grief, hallucinations were common. Grief-induced psychosis existed. But grief as a literal force that could manipulate reality, that wasn't in the literature. Janet called on Thursday afternoon. I saw him again. I'm going to talk to him this time. I'm done being afraid. Janet, wait. But Janet had already hung up. Meredith tried calling back, got voicemail, left a message that was probably too urgent, too revealing of her own destabilization. She drove to Janet's apartment in the Mission, arriving just as evening fog rolled in from the ocean. That signature San Francisco phenomenon that made the city feel like it existed in two states simultaneously, solid and dissolving, present and absent. Janet's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that needed earthquake retrofitting and probably wouldn't survive the next major tremor. Meredith buzzed, got no answer, buzzed again. A neighbor leaving the building let her in. That casual security failure that made cities both livable and dangerous. She climbed to the 3rd floor, knocked on Janet's door. No answer. Tried the knob. Unlocked. That specific kind of unlocked that felt wrong. That suggested someone had left in a hurry or hadn't left at all. Janet? Meredith pushed the door open. The apartment was empty. Not just unoccupied. Empty. No furniture, no belongings, no evidence that anyone had lived here. The walls were bare. The floors were clean. The air smelled of nothing. That complete absence of scent that characterized spaces between occupancies. Spaces waiting for life to fill them. Meredith pulled out her phone, called Janet's number, heard ringing from somewhere deep in the apartment, followed the sound to the bedroom, found a cell phone lying in the center of the empty floor. Janet's phone. Meredith recognized the case. Purple with a photo of Janet and Daniel from their trip to Point Reyes. She picked it up, looked at the screen. One missed call from Meredith. No messages. No other activity. The last text message was from Tuesday. I found him. I'm going to bring him back. Meredith sat on the floor of the empty apartment, holding her patient's phone, understanding with sudden clarity what had happened. Janet had found Daniel, had touched him, had made contact that completed whatever circuit grief had created, and the exchange had occurred. Janet's life for Daniel's, one reality traded for another. The living and the dead swapping places because grief refused to accept that love could end just because breathing stopped. She should call the police. Report a missing person. But how would she explain this? that her patient had been seeing her dead boyfriend, that the dead boyfriend had warned Meredith that contact would trigger an exchange, that now the patient was gone and the apartment was empty as if Janet had never existed at all. Meredith left the apartment, left the building, drove back to her office on Divisadero Street, sat at her desk in the dark, trying to decide what ethical obligations applied when reality itself violated the rules. She was supposed to document, supposed to file reports, supposed to maintain boundaries between her role and her patient's life. But Janet didn't have a life anymore. Janet had traded her life for Daniel's, had loved someone so desperately that she'd literally pulled him back from death and paid for his return with her own existence. And Meredith had watched it happen, had enabled it by telling Janet to approach Daniel, by treating grief as a symptom to be managed instead of as a force powerful enough to rewrite what was possible. She opened her patient files, found Janet's folder, read through 9 months of session notes documenting a woman's descent into desperate hope that death was negotiable. The last note was from their previous session. Patient continues to report seeing deceased partner. Recommended exposure technique. Meredith added one final note. Patient discontinued therapy. No forwarding contact information provided. It was inadequate documentation. It violated protocols. But it was all she could write without explaining that her patient had disappeared into wherever the dead went, that grief had become a door that swung both ways, that love was powerful enough to break natural law, but not powerful enough to do it without cost. She filed the note, closed Janet's folder, and sat in her dark office, looking at the rain-streaked windows. Tomorrow she would see her other patients, would sit in this chair and listen to grief and depression and anxiety and all the ways people hurt when life hurt them, would offer strategies and frameworks and evidence-based interventions that assumed reality was stable, that death was permanent, that love was powerful but not that powerful, and she would never mention Janet Marsh to anyone. Would never explain what happened to the grieving woman who loved someone so desperately she'd traded her existence for his return. Would carry this knowledge alone because some truths couldn't be shared. Some experiences couldn't be documented. Some sessions ended not with healing but with understanding that grief was bigger than therapy, older than psychology, powerful enough to bend reality itself. Meredith Kane sat in the dark and thought about all the grieving patients she'd counseled over 15 years, all the people who'd begged for second chances, who'd insisted their loved ones weren't truly gone, who'd seen the dead in crowds and heard their voices and felt their presence. She'd treated all of them as symptoms to be managed. But now she wondered how many had been telling the truth. How many had actually seen what they claimed to see? How many had touched their dead and disappeared into exchange that grief demanded, that love enabled, that reality accommodated because some forces were older than physics, stronger than death? She locked her office, went home, and tried to sleep. But sleep felt like surrender, like the state Daniel had described. Aware but unable to wake, caught between existence and absence. So Meredith stayed awake, watching fog press against her windows, and wondered if grief was watching back. If somewhere in the city Janet Marsh existed in the space where Daniel had been, learning what it meant to be dead, to be remembered, to be loved enough that someone might eventually try to pull her back. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it was terrifying. Because if grief could pull the dead back, then no one ever truly rested. The dead were just waiting, trapped in nowhere nothing, hoping someone would love them enough to trade places. And the living were always one touch away from disappearing, from learning that resurrection was real but required sacrifice, that death was negotiable but demanded payment. Meredith thought about Daniel Mercer walking the streets of San Francisco, alive again, existing in the space Janet had vacated. She wondered if he remembered being dead, if he felt guilty, if he would eventually grieve Janet the way Janet had grieved him, if that grief would pull Janet back and create another exchange, another swap, an eternal cycle of loving and losing and trading places. She never saw Daniel again, never saw Janet again. But sometimes, walking through the city, Meredith would see couples holding hands and wonder which one was real and which one had been pulled back from death by grief too desperate to accept permanence. Wonder which one would eventually disappear. Wonder if they knew the cost of resurrection, or if they'd learned only after contact, after the exchange, after love proved itself powerful enough to break natural law, but not powerful enough to break it for free. Dr. Meredith Kane continued her practice, continued counseling grief, but she never again told a patient to approach what they were seeing. Never again treated grief as a symptom to be managed instead of as a force to be respected. Never again assumed that death was permanent just because science said it should be. Some truths couldn't be fit into diagnostic criteria. Some exchanges happened outside therapeutic frameworks. Some sessions ended not with healing, but with absence. Story 5. The resort looked like teeth in November. Evelyn Ross stood at the edge of the property, watching fog roll through the empty pools and abandoned cabanas, and thought about metaphors for things that consumed. The Blackwater Resort had been closed for 6 years. Bankruptcy following a series of lawsuits following a drowning that had been ruled accidental but felt like the kind of accident that happened when people stopped paying attention, when maintenance was deferred, when profit mattered more than safety. She was 47 years old, recently divorced, recently unemployed, and recently desperate enough to accept a caretaker position that paid barely above minimum wage to watch over a resort that would probably never reopen, that was slowly being reclaimed by the Oregon coast's particular brand of aggressive vegetation. Blackberry vines that grew 6 inches a day, salal that choked out anything less determined, sword ferns that transformed cleared spaces back into forest with patient inevitability. The position had been advertised as seasonal, November through March, when winter storms made the coast uninhabitable for anyone not born to it. Evelyn had been born in Coos Bay, 40 miles south, and knew exactly what winter meant here. Endless rain, wind that made standing upright an act of defiance, fog so thick you could taste the salt and decay in it. She knew and accepted it because the alternative was returning to her sister's house in Portland, sleeping on a couch, being pitied by family who'd warned her about Marcus, who'd said the marriage wouldn't last, who'd been right in ways that made their sympathy feel like punishment. The resort manager was a man named Vincent Herrera, probably 60, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and the particular resignation of someone managing a property that was dying but not yet dead. He walked Evelyn through the grounds, 12 cabins arranged in a horseshoe around a central lodge, 2 pools now filled with rainwater and algae, tennis courts whose nets had rotted through seasons ago. Main job is preventing vandalism, Vincent said, his voice nearly lost in the wind. Kids sometimes come up from Bandon, break windows, spray paint walls. You see anyone, call the Coos County Sheriff. Don't try to handle it yourself. What happened here? Evelyn asked. Why did it close? Vincent stopped walking, looked at the main pool where fog had settled like something living. Kid drowned, 16 years old, on vacation with his family. Happened during a party. Too many people drinking, not enough supervision. By the time anyone noticed he was missing, he'd been underwater for 20 minutes. Place never recovered. Liability, lawsuits, bad publicity. Owners declared bankruptcy, walked away. That's awful. Yeah. His name was Cameron. Cameron Torres. I knew his family. Watched him grow up. They stayed here every summer since he was a baby. Vincent's voice had gone quiet. Some places remember things like that. Remember them in ways that aren't healthy. He showed Evelyn to cabin 7, which would serve as her living quarters. 1 bedroom, small kitchen, bathroom with rust stains that wouldn't scrub clean, furniture that had been left behind when the resort closed, a couch with springs showing through worn upholstery, a dining table scarred from years of use, a bed with a mattress she immediately decided to replace. You'll be alone here, Vincent said. Completely alone. No other staff, no guests. Place is closed. If that bothers you. It doesn't, Evelyn interrupted. Alone sounded perfect. Alone sounded like exactly what she needed after 2 years of Marcus's affairs and lies and the particular cruelty of someone who'd promised forever and delivered betrayal instead. Vincent left her his number, said he'd check in weekly, drove away in a truck that looked older than Evelyn felt. She stood in the doorway of cabin 7, watching taillights disappear into fog, feeling the silence settle around her like weight. The first week was maintenance. She walked the property daily, checking for damage, documenting needed repairs in a notebook Vincent had provided. The pools were worse than they looked. Cracked concrete, broken tiles, filtration systems that had seized from years of neglect. The cabins were weathering poorly, their cedar siding gray and splitting, windows cloudy with moisture trapped between panes. But the lodge was worst. 3 stories. The central building where guests had gathered for meals and activities and all the forced socialization that resorts promised and guests pretended to want. The main doors were locked, but Evelyn had keys to everything. She entered through the front, stepping into a vast room that smelled of mold and mouse droppings and that particular decay of indoor spaces exposed to coastal weather without benefit of heating or maintenance. The furniture remained, tables and chairs arranged for meals that would never be served. A piano in the corner, keys yellow and some missing, a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, cold and dark, and filled with the nests of birds that had entered through the chimney. On the walls, photographs from better times, families smiling, children swimming, couples dancing at events that had felt important once and now existed only as images of people who'd moved on to other resorts, other vacations, other memories. Evelyn spent hours in the lodge, cleaning what could be cleaned, documenting what couldn't. She found the wall of fame near the main desk. Photographs of guests who'd returned year after year. The resort's family, as the plaque described them. She found the Torres family in a photograph from 15 years ago. Parents, older daughter, young boy who must have been Cameron, all smiling in that particular way. People smile for resort photos, that performance of happiness that may or may not reflect reality. She found Cameron's photograph again in a memorial section someone had created after his death. The same image from the family photo, enlarged and framed, and accompanied by a plaque that read, Cameron Torres, 2001-2017, forever part of our Blackwater family. Evelyn stood looking at the photograph for longer than was reasonable. Cameron had been beautiful in that way teenage boys sometimes were, all angles and potential. The kind of face that suggested he would have grown into striking adulthood if he'd been given the chance. His eyes were dark, intense, looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed knowing somehow, as if he understood even then that this photograph would outlast him, would become the evidence that he'd existed and mattered and been loved. That night, Evelyn heard someone swimming. She was in cabin 7, reading by the light of the single lamp that worked. When she heard it clearly, splashing from the direction of the main pool, the sound of someone doing laps, rhythmic and steady. She looked at her watch, 11:43. She should call the sheriff. That was protocol. Vincent had been clear. Any sign of trespassers, call for help. But Evelyn found herself pulling on her jacket and walking toward the pool instead. Flashlight in hand, that particular mixture of courage and stupidity that characterized most of her decisions lately. The pool was empty. The water, stagnant and green and thick with algae, hadn't been disturbed. But the sound continued, clear and unmistakable, the splash of someone swimming laps in a pool that contained no swimmer. Evelyn stood at the edge, shining her flashlight across the surface. The water reflected the beam, that flat return of light that suggested nothing beneath the surface except depth and darkness, and perhaps the bones of blackberry vines that had rooted in the concrete cracks. The splashing stopped. The silence that replaced it felt expectant somehow. Felt like something was waiting for her to respond, to acknowledge what she'd heard, even though acknowledging meant accepting that sound didn't always require source, that some places remembered activities so strongly they replayed them endlessly, ghost recordings on a loop. She went back to cabin 7, locked the door, and tried to convince herself she'd imagined it. Projection of loneliness onto silence. Her mind creating presence where none existed because solitude was still new and uncomfortable and her brain wasn't yet adjusted to being truly alone. But the swimming continued every night. Always starting around 11:43. Always lasting 20 to 30 minutes. Always from the main pool, though the water never moved, never showed any evidence of disturbance. Evelyn called Vincent during his weekly check. "Do you ever hear anything strange here? At night?" Static on the line. The connection was poor. The resort tucked into coastal geography that blocked cell signals. Then Vincent's voice. "Like what?" "Like someone swimming. In the main pool." Silence. Longer than was comfortable. Finally, "Cameron drowned around midnight. He'd been swimming laps before it happened. The autopsy suggested he'd been in the water for at least half an hour before he went under." "Does everyone hear it? Every caretaker?" "Most quit before they mention it. You're the 4th this year. Others lasted 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then they leave without explanation, stop answering calls. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have taken the job if I had?" Evelyn didn't answer. She wouldn't have. No one would voluntarily accept a position watching over a resort that was haunted by a drowned teenager who swam laps nightly in a pool that had killed him. She should quit. That was the reasonable response. Pack her belongings, call Vincent, tell him to find someone else. But Evelyn had nowhere to go. No other job prospects. No resources beyond the meager paycheck this position provided. And more than that, she'd discovered something unexpected in her weeks here. The swimming didn't frighten her. It was company. Proof that she wasn't entirely alone. That something else existed in this space. even if that something was only an echo of a boy who died doing what he loved. She started sitting by the pool during the swimming, brought a chair, a book, a thermos of tea, listened to the splashing, the rhythm of strokes, the occasional splash that suggested a flip turn. Sometimes she talked, though she felt absurd doing it. Told Cameron about her day, about the repairs she was documenting, about Marcus and the divorce, and how strange it was to be 47 and starting over. She never heard a response, but the swimming seemed to acknowledge her presence somehow, seemed to last longer when she was there, seemed to vary its rhythm as if responding to her voice, even though that was impossible. Even though dead teenage boys didn't swim in empty pools and definitely didn't interact with lonely middle-aged caretakers who were probably losing their minds from isolation. December arrived with storms that made the coast feel like the edge of the world, like standing at the boundary of civilization looking out at chaos. Evelyn secured the cabins, boarded windows that were cracking, cleared drains that had clogged with leaves and needles. The work was physical and exhausting, and exactly what she needed. Tasks that required attention, that left her too tired to think about the life she'd lost, the marriage that had failed, the future that felt blank as the fog that pressed constantly against every surface. She was securing the last window on cabin 12 when she saw the boy. He was standing at the edge of the main pool wearing swim trunks, dripping wet even though it was pouring rain and 40 degrees, and no sane person would be swimming in this weather. He looked exactly like his photograph. Cameron Torres at 16, beautiful and doomed, and watching Evelyn with an expression that was difficult to read, not quite hostile, not quite friendly. Something in between that suggested curiosity or assessment, or perhaps just acknowledgement that she was there, that she'd stayed longer than the others, that she'd earned some kind of recognition. Evelyn stood frozen, hammer in hand, rain soaking through her jacket. She should run, should get in her car and drive to Bandon and call Vincent and never come back. But she didn't, couldn't. Something in Cameron's expression held her there, something that looked like loneliness recognizing loneliness, like isolation calling to isolation across the boundary between living and dead. Cameron? Her voice was barely audible over the rain. He nodded, slow, deliberate. Then he turned and walked into the lodge, leaving wet footprints that shouldn't exist, that violated every rule of what was possible. Evelyn followed. She told herself later that she'd been compelled, that some force had overridden her survival instinct and pulled her into the lodge after a dead boy who'd been drowned for 6 years. But that wasn't true. She'd followed because she wanted to, because Cameron had looked at her and seen her, and that recognition felt like the first genuine human, or human-adjacent connection she'd had since Marcus had sat her down and explained that he'd been sleeping with his dental hygienist for 8 months and wanted a divorce. The lodge was darker than it should have been, the afternoon light somehow unable to penetrate the windows. Cameron stood in the center of the main room, water pooling around his feet, watching Evelyn with those dark, intense eyes that held knowledge no 16-year-old should possess. "You're not real," Evelyn said, testing the words, seeing how they felt. "You're a ghost, an echo, something this place remembers." Cameron tilted his head, that gesture of consideration. When he spoke, his voice was waterlogged somehow, thick and distorted like speech filtered through liquid. "What if I'm more real than you are? What if you're the echo, and I'm what's permanent?" The question hung in the air between them. Evelyn felt her heart pounding, felt the cold seep into her bones from her rain-soaked jacket, felt reality tilting in a way that suggested she'd crossed some threshold without realizing it. That standing in this lodge talking to this dead boy had changed something fundamental about what was possible. "What do you want?" she asked. "Company. Everyone leaves. The caretakers come and hear me swimming and they leave. But you stayed. You sat with me. You talked to me." "I was talking to myself." "No, you were talking to me, and I heard you. I hear everyone, all the time, every person who walks through here. But you're the first who stayed long enough to talk, who treated me like I was still here instead of just a sound in the night." Evelyn felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd built to protect herself from exactly this kind of connection, this kind of need. Cameron wasn't just haunting the resort. He was trapped here, alone, replaying his death nightly, because that was the only existence left to him. Swimming laps until he drowned, drowning and returning to swim again. Eternal loop of the last thing he'd done before everything ended. "How do I help you?" The words surprised her, but once spoken, felt right. This was why she'd stayed. This was what the universe or fate or random chance had been preparing her for. Not to watch over an empty resort, but to witness this boy's loneliness. To offer what she could, even though what she could offer was minimal, was just presence and acknowledgement and the particular gift of being seen. "You can't. I'm stuck. This is where I ended. So this is where I exist. But you can stay. You can keep me company. You can make the loop less lonely." "For how long?" Cameron smiled. And it was a terrible smile. A smile that held understanding of what he was asking. "Forever. Or until you leave like everyone else." That was the choice then. Stay here and keep company with a dead boy who'd been alone for 6 years. Who would be alone forever unless someone volunteered to share his isolation. Or leave and return to the world of the living. To Portland and her sister's pity. To job applications and rejections and the slow rebuilding of a life that had been shattered by betrayal. Evelyn thought about Marcus, about 2 years of lies and affairs, and the particular cruelty of someone who'd watched her believe their marriage was solid while knowing he was dismantling it piece by piece. She thought about Cabin 7, and its rust-stained bathroom, and worn furniture, and the silence that had felt like relief, instead of punishment. She thought about sitting by the pool listening to swimming, about feeling less alone in the presence of a ghost than she'd felt in the presence of her husband. "I'll stay," she said. Cameron's smile shifted, became something closer to genuine, became relief that made him look his actual age, 16 and scared and grateful that someone had finally chosen him, had finally decided his company was worth the cost. "Thank you," he said. And then he was gone, vanished like he'd never been there, leaving only wet footprints that faded as Evelyn watched. She walked back to Cabin 7, changed into dry clothes, made tea. That night, at 11:43, she heard the swimming start and carried her chair to the pool. Sat in the rain listening to strokes and splashes and the sound of a boy who would swim forever, who would drown every night at midnight and return the next night to swim again. It should have been horrifying, but Evelyn found it comforting. She wasn't alone. Cameron wasn't alone. They were together in this space that the world had forgotten, this resort that had closed and been abandoned by everyone except a dead teenager and a divorced caretaker who'd both learned that sometimes being seen by anyone, even by someone impossible, mattered more than being safe, or reasonable, or sane. Vincent called less frequently, eventually stopped calling at all. The paychecks continued for 3 months, then stopped. Evelyn didn't notice immediately. She had enough savings to cover the minimal expenses of living in an abandoned resort, and money mattered less when there was nowhere to spend it. No reason to leave. No life waiting beyond the property boundaries. The seasons changed. Winter became spring. Spring became summer. Tourists returned to the coast, but none came to the Blackwater Resort, which had been closed so long people forgot it existed. Evelyn maintained the property with the dedication of someone who understood she was caretaking. Not just buildings, but the space where Cameron existed, the boundaries of his eternal present. She grew older, 50, then 55. Her hair went gray. Her hands developed arthritis that made repairs difficult. But she stayed. Sat by the pool every night at 11:43. Talked to Cameron about everything and nothing. Told him stories about the world beyond the resort. Though that world felt increasingly distant, increasingly irrelevant. Sometimes she saw him during the day, standing at the edge of the property, watching fog roll in, sitting in the lodge at the piano, fingers moving over keys that made no sound, walking the grounds with an expression that suggested he was looking for something he'd lost but couldn't quite remember. She never asked if he was happy. Happiness seemed like the wrong metric for existence that was mostly memory, mostly repetition, mostly the same events looping endlessly. But she thought he was less lonely. Thought maybe that was enough. Thought maybe two lonely people keeping each other company across the boundary between living and dead was its own kind of success, its own kind of healing. Evelyn Ross died in Cabin 7 on a November morning 20 years after accepting the caretaker position. Heart attack, sudden and complete. Her body was found 3 weeks later when her sister finally hired someone to check on her. When authorities broke down the door and discovered a woman who'd been dead long enough that identifying her required dental records. The resort was condemned, demolished the following spring. The land sold to developers who built condominiums that blocked ocean views and rented to people who had no idea what had existed there before, who slept peacefully, unaware that beneath their floors was earth that remembered a pool where a boy had drowned, where a woman had sat vigil for 2 decades, where loneliness had found loneliness and decided that was enough. That being seen was worth the cost, that some kinds of haunting were mutual and chosen and maybe even beautiful in their own terrible way. And on November nights, when fog rolls through and the wind carries salt and decay, residents of the condominiums sometimes hear what sounds like swimming. Rhythmic splashing, steady strokes, the particular cadence of someone doing laps. They mention it to each other, or laugh about it, call it acoustics, or imagination, or the ocean playing tricks. But sometimes they hear something else. A woman's voice, distant and patient, talking to the swimmer, telling stories, offering company, making the eternal loop less lonely. And if they listen very carefully, they can almost hear the swimmer respond, can almost catch the words of a conversation between people who chose each other across every boundary that should have separated them, who decided that being together in isolation was better than being alone in the world, who learned that some hauntings were invitations, some ghosts were just people who needed witnessing, and some kinds of forever were worth the price of giving up everything else. Thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. We've walked through spaces where grief becomes tangible, where isolation transforms into something that watches back, where the boundary between what we are and what we're becoming grows thin enough to cross. If these stories found you in the right moment, if they gave you something to hold on to, or something to fear, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe for more journeys into the territories we usually avoid. Sleep well, if you can. And remember, sometimes the stillness is just silence, but sometimes it's listening. Until we meet again in the spaces between waking and dreaming, this has been the Stillness Broadcast. May your darkness be gentle, and may the things that wait in it know mercy.